Yeah.
It's mostly kind of workload consolidation, whether you're also looking at analytics, just plain data analytics, or with time series data or computer vision. So it's just a lot of different types of workloads. And it all comes down to the point too, is that not all use cases or not all problems need AI. In most cases, it may just need statistical analysis of looking at onesie, twosies, looking how many widgets of devices do I have in my manufacturing floor, et cetera. So that's one of the key trends that we're seeing at Intel.
That leads me, sorry, see, I keep going off topic here, but that leads me to just such a great question. You talked about how we're using AI for lots of different things. Do you feel like because AI and machine learning are shiny new toys in the developer's toolbox, do you feel like we're trying to do things with AI sometimes where it's not actually necessary? And I'd love to open that up to everyone.
You know what, I come more from a large enterprise background. I think I think the comment that Zoe talked about is very applicable. You know, the reality is maybe we're talking too much about AI, and the foundation is, what is the problem? What is the opportunity? What's the value? What's the benefit? What the methods are. So this is all about problem solving. And, you know, you still have to, if you're in any company, build a business case to be able to justify an approach. It doesn't mean that you can't have an innovation lab and access to low cost tools that can allow you to do some ideation. And ideation is great. But recognize ideation only takes you so far without the sponsorship, right? So, you know, you really have to be alert and I think aware of the context of the culture that you're in and whether or not you've got the ability to move, you know, some of these ideas forward. Where I see things failing is lots of creative ideas, but they're not really well thought through from a business perspective, and there's a lack of executive sponsorship. Like with most innovation, if you don't plan the executive sponsorship and build the case in the journey, you're not going to necessarily have the you know, the ability to keep things moving. You know, the nice thing about high school students is everything's up for grabs. You're at the stage that's so exciting, you know, where you can go to school and hopefully you can have access to, you know, incubator constructs are very powerful, right? So there really are no barriers at this stage in your lives, right? So just, I think the most important thing is the best innovators in this world are those that are curious. They never lose their curiosity. They are constantly have courage to challenge, look beyond, but the brightest ones will recognize that there's always many different perspectives to bring to bear. And I think that's really critical. This is a collective area where multiple disciplines need to be involved. Even people that are studying religion and theology can come into this. You know, reflection and renewal is the #1 skill for CEOs right now, worldwide. And obviously with COVID, you know, going on and the sense of appreciation for mental illness, that's an area where we're going to see a lot of growth for AI is around mental illness for people with screen fatigue and alerts, you know, to how much time you're spending online and the implications there for being productive and given more the isolation that we have. So yeah, lots of perspective, but if you don't grind out the, you know, what you're trying to do and accomplish and be clear, you know, you can go down a rabbit hole and, you know, it might be interesting intellectually, but you might not go anywhere.
You teed me up again. I love it. So that reflection and renewal bit about how sort of that's the most valuable skill for an executive right now. That's great because Akash asked this wonderful question: which occupations / chores / work do you think that, and Akash is using the term robots, but we could understand that to mean more generally, you know, automatons, androids, basically anything you might see in a science fiction film. So, which occupations, chores, and works do you think robots and AI can never replace? And I would like each of you to come up with one. That's my challenge to you in our final question here as we wrap up the student Q&A. Great question, Akash. Thank you. And you can cheat a little bit.
I can start first.
Awesome. Okay, great.
A robot and AI can never replace my mom.
Short and sweet. And Dr. Gordon, if you wanted to kind of elaborate on what you were talking about with the reflection and renewal from an executive standpoint, like I guess you don't see an AI taking over the helm of a major corporation anytime soon. Is that correct?
Not anytime soon.
Ooh, spicy.
The reality is that I'll be long dead and gone, but I think we are at a point where we are going to see, humans like to simplify things, right? And we will continue to pioneer to drive simplicity, to drive up productivity. And that is just how humans are, right? So I think it's very exciting. Now, to the point, I loved Amit's answer about my mom. However, in the future, it's not inconceivable that my mom will live forever.
Dang. Okay. Anyone else want to jump in for me here?
Yeah, I think we're all social beings, and it's globalization is going to become maybe reshaped in the future. And I think kind of that touch point between human to human, requirements gathering, kind of that whole interaction, it's be hard for an AI to completely replace. They can augment certainly, but I look forward to my chats with my brother and my son and my daughter and my colleagues at work, right? That's how we form relationships as humans. And that's powerful. And that's where creativity and innovation starts. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would also maybe just going back to Amit's point, is his mom. I would say like jobs where human instincts and human connection, human emotions are required. Those are going to be really hard to replace, especially when you don't have the examples as inputs to your model. Coming back to an example that where we've worked on recently, we had it was a financial services company, and their model was out to look at fraud detection. But what they're looking for is if the person's IP address is different, the geo IP address is different from what their usual geolocation. What they're not looking at is the human experience of, say, maybe that person is an expat and they're traveling around the world and they may not be in Thailand forever. So you need that human intervention to look at. But okay, what is the human experience outside of all the mathematical equations? Sorry, my Bluetooth connection just went out. That's the technology weakness part. And in most cases, Bluetooth connections are not going to be as trustworthy, and that's the same with AI. And in some cases, you'll need that human intervention.
Great answer. Thank you.
I'd like to add one more thing. I was a young student once, and somebody told me there's something called as talent. And talent is defined as, it's not competency, it's not skill, it's not knowledge, it's not like, anything hard. Talent is like, if I don't have empathy, I can never become a nurse. Like, that is the fundamental part of a human which cannot be replaced. Like, it's that core, right? The machine learning is just decision making, faster decision making, repeatable decision making again and again. But that's all, right? It's a tool.
Frank, do you want to jump in?
Of course. I've got lots to say. I think my answer to this is none. Eventually, but
I thought I was safe.
Just to just to bring it back to, I think what's actually core for like inside all of the questions that I see scrolling by and reflect on how you can get involved in these sorts of things. This eventually is a long ways off, right? You know, I'm not worried about my 5-year-old kid having a job or like being replaced by a robot or so on and so forth. You know, I work directly on staving off information theoretic death. Like there's all sorts of stuff. But what I see in the questions and what I'd like to resolutely make clear to the youngsters out there is that it's exciting. There's a lot to learn. You don't have to choose your life. You don't have to make choices based on net present value and cash flow and these sorts of things, right? We don't understand anything. We don't understand what learning is. We don't understand what consciousness is. We don't understand what sleep is. We don't know how unsupervised learning works, which is actually how human beings work. We don't know how to make a car drive automatically. We don't know how to make a language model that actually doesn't spit out gibberish. We're talking about AI like it exists, like we can apply it, blah, 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 blah. What we're really talking about is we can take a regression model, feed it some data, and make something happen. You know, if you have the balls or the whatever to go out and actually try to work on something that's cool and like really changes the world, and like we just don't understand AI, intelligence, this stuff we do not understand, right? It's nowhere near being understood. You know, DeepMind is putting billions of dollars and 700 of the brightest people on the planet to work on trying to solve this problem. It's so far from being solved, right? And it's super awesome. And kids who are in high school that are dreaming about this sort of stuff, like, go for it, right? There are so many questions. The hype is too much right now. We don't know what we're doing. There's an enormous opportunity. And to be perfectly honest, what you need to do is you need to go learn your math. You need to go learn your science. Like, it's incredibly competitive to get into even UBC. It's incredibly competitive to get into graduate school. It's really, really hard stuff. You can do a lot of stuff, but if you really want to get into it and become somebody who works on AI, you really, really have to focus on the fundamentals, right? Like, no joking around, like, get in there and do it. And I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
That's a fantastic place to leave it. I just want to thank all of you for taking time on your Sunday to join this. I had an absolute blast. It's always fun where, I'm supposed to be helping the viewers learn and I end up doing the actual learning. And it's great moderating these things because I get to ask all my own questions first. You guys were absolutely a total pleasure to talk to. And thanks again to the organizers at AI4Youth. This was a blast, and I think there's another panel coming on soon, so I'm going to yield my microphone over to them and go have some lunch.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much to our moderator, of course, Linus, and all of her panelists today, Amit, Dr. Gordon, Zoe, Frank, and Tony. For all of our fellow students, thank you so much for tuning in. Much like the unexpected events of COVID-19, we did have an unexpected technical issue regarding with the names and the link joining into the conference. If you have your name as Bonita Shao, please change it to your real name or whatever you're comfortable with. Bonita is our excellent marketing director, and she's some technical difficulties, but it's perfect. Thank you all for tuning in.
Awesome. And also, please be sure to stick around as after a 15-minute bio break, we'll be starting our next panel, which is our special student panel, which includes upcoming U of T and Stanford students who have started their own AI projects or companies, which is happening at 2:55 p.m. MST, which is, I believe, 1:55 PST. And so please stick around if you want to learn more from your fellow high school students about how you can maybe get started with your own AI projects or even innovations. Additionally, we also have a deep dive panel, number 1, ethics, security, and privacy, starting later today with 5 other amazing, extremely brilliant and inspiring panelists. And I couldn't help notice, but there's a lot of other ethics questions that you guys had that might not have been answered in this panel. But please join in later on today and you can get your questions answered there. So tune in then. And then additionally, we're also going to have a deep dive panel number 2, which is all about finance and AI. And so if Jonathan, you want to send out that Google Docs link, or Yusuf, but all our information is there for our panelists, as well as our conference details and timing and schedules. So please check that out. And so we'll see you guys in 15 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Nice job, Linus.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again to everyone.
Take care.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Sorry for the minor delay. Our moderator for the next portion simply just had some connections issues with his audio. Before we start, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you're not a moderator, a speaker, or an AI4Youth team member, we just ask that you keep your mic off so that this conference can run as smoothly as possible. And don't forget that the link in the chat will lead you to our brochure, which includes a promo code that allows you to enter the Brain Toy course and activity. With our promo code, you will be saving $99 USD on the class. And the floor is yours, Nick.
Thank you very much, Jerry. So hello, everyone. Now that our 15-minute break is over, I'm so proud to announce our conference's second discussion, the student panel. For scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, being innovative is the ultimate goal. The ability to improve people's lives is the foundation of progress which drives humanity forward. Whether it is a novel way to diagnose a disease, a study of cosmology and dark matter, or a method to track changes in market behavior. But it's one thing to set out to innovate and another to actually achieve it. The three individuals on our student panel today are well on their way to do exactly that. A warm welcome to our three panelists, Asmaina Brer, Brendan Matush, and Shnok Ray. Can you guys hear me, and are your mics working, three of you?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Yep.
Awesome.
Hearing you loud and clear.
Awesome. So I'll start off with a bit of introductions. I'm Nicholas Wilger, AI4Youth Canada's Regional Director, and I'll be guiding the discussion for the next half hour. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to remind everyone that questions are encouraged. If you have any you'd like to ask, please type them in the chats, and I'll be selecting a few to ask our student panelists during our Q&A session beginning at 3:25. We have shifted our schedule by 10 minutes. Asmaina Brer, our first speaker, is a recently graduated high school student and technology entrepreneur who is also the founder and CEO of Popular, an AI-driven market intelligence software company. At Popular, Asmaina and his team are currently building a system that analyzes people's thoughts, opinions, and emotions on the internet to help businesses predict changes in market and consumer behavior. Working with natural language processing and emotionally intelligent machine learning in partnership with several Canadian academic institutions and AI experts, Asmaina's goal is to develop Popular into a crystal ball of sorts that can forecast almost anything externally affecting a business without compromising people's privacy. Brendan Matush, our second speaker today, is an incoming freshman at Stanford University. He's been researching subjects related to machine learning for several years now, and has presented his work at events including Intel ICEF and the NVIDIA GTC. He has interned at SnowLab, applying machine learning to dark matter detection, and at the Vector Institute, researching unsupervised exploration in reinforcement learning. He also has experience programming robots and autonomous vehicles, and participated in the first robotics competition. Shnok, our final speaker, is excited by almost anything to do with data and is always keen to uncover insights from them. Exploring applications ranging from medical diagnostics to educational intelligence, he enjoys discovering how analytics can make our lives more efficient and just better. Shnok has received accolades for his research on improving the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, such as the Youth Can Innovate Award, and was selected as one of 8 representatives on Team Canada ICEF. After a gap year, he will be attending Stanford as well to study computer science and management. So enough of me talking, let's begin our panel discussion. Asmaina, Brendan, and Shnok, the fact that you're here on this panel discussion today means you have some experience in AI already, whether in the form of a project or your own startup. So with this question, I want you guys to think back to your first major experience in AI, when you were first truly introduced to it. Tell us about that experience. Brendan, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So I'm sure we have a lot of Canada-wide Science Fair alumni listening here. So Canada-wide Science Fair was kind of back in 2016 in Montreal. That was the first time I was sort of learned about AI and machine learning. I saw some people with fantastic projects on, there was one that was generating music, another that was a self-driving car in a simulation. I didn't know anything about machine learning at that time, but I was just fascinated by that and decided that I would, pretty much spend the whole next year trying to learn how to do it, and then coming up with a project for the following year's Canada-wide Science Fair. And yeah, so that 1 year kind of turned into 4 years so far. So it's been a long time interest since then.
Awesome. What about you, Asmain?
Yeah, I think Brandon and I kind of have a similar story here, and I think it's a story that a lot of people who get into AI at a young age tend to share. The fact that we didn't really know anything to begin with when it came to this, what seems like a really complex and nuanced thing that it seems to take, years of research and a degree of some sort in advanced statistical analysis to try and understand. But once you really get into it, once you realize that that's not really the case, that things are a lot more different than they seem at the surface, I think it becomes quite enjoyable and fun. So for me, the way that I discovered AI was really more of a going through Google and looking at recent things that were happening in the technology field. I just like to do that, every now and then. I look through the newest developments in the field. And I started realizing that natural language processing had been quite a quickly developing field that people were talking about on places like Twitter and on Google News and sorts of stuff like that. But what really fascinated me about natural language processing when I was first looking it up at that time, that was about a year or so ago, was that we are normally familiarized with that kind of technology through like our phones, right? We've got our virtual assistants, we've got Siri, Cortana, Google Assistant, whatever you want to name. But most of the time, they're not really the kinds of natural language processors that you see in sci-fi movies and, the Jarvis and Iron Man, that kind of system. And so I just became curious about why that is. Why haven't we, after this much time and research and effort and these multi-billion-dollar companies working at this problem, not been able to figure out natural language processing without its quirks and actually being able to create stuff that makes sense? And as I started looking deeper and deeper into it, I found these crazy pockets of problems and how humans process language. And I started becoming fascinated by it. And so eventually I got the idea for Popular to analyze human speech, thoughts, opinions, emotions, everything on the internet. And I kept researching, and here we are.
Yeah, that seems to be the way so many people learn now. Like this Google, there's so much information out there just for us. What about you, Shanok? How did you get introduced to AI?
Yeah, sure. Oh, well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you, Nicholas, for the introduction. My first experience in AI was a bit different. So in grade 10, I was working on a project actually. So I guess same in that regard, on actually really using data analytics, not AI specifically, on identifying people's thoughts and emotions to reduce forgetfulness. And that wasn't involving AI or anything. But then at some point, I needed something that was more robust, something that was more comprehensive and that had more statistical power than the current tests that we have. So like significance tests, like there are a variety of mathematical models out there that can do a lot of the predictive work that you have in AI, but AI has a different dimension to it, as in it can actually find those patterns for you that typical statistical tests cannot. And that fascinated me. Like, wow, like what is the math behind something like AI that automatically finds these patterns? So I actually started doing some research into the math behind it and got like super into that. And that's when I actually applied it on my next project, which was really analyzing speech, demographic, and movement data to better improve the diagnostic process for Parkinson's disease. And AI was just the perfect fit for that, since it helped me identify those patterns in all the 3 different dimensions of data that I was dealing with and actually improve the diagnostic rate. And that's really where it all took off. And I'm working on that and some other forefronts on educational intelligence that I'm sure we get to talk about as the panel progresses.
Yeah, what Asmain and you really talked about was how you further fostered your interest after that initial introduction. So Brendan, talk us through about some of the projects that you have done just to further foster your interest.
Sure. So
The first things I did with machine learning were mostly computer vision, so image classification. One of the earliest projects I did was classifying apples and bananas based on how rotten they were, which was kind of fun. But after that, like what I would say my first big project was I decided that I was going to try and make a self-driving car. So
Wow.
I took like a go-kart and set it up with a motor on the steering column so I could control it, and mounted a camera on the top and stuff, and did all of the vision code to drove down the road many times, recording images, and then classified them to train a model to recognize where the road lines were, and then did the control code to get it to actually steer and remain within the lines. So yeah, I basically like turned a go-kart into a self-driving car, and that was my first.
Yeah, that's a pretty big first project to have. So yeah, the three of you have so much experience in AI already that you've kind of like so self-motivated. You go find your own projects, do your own research, things like that. So let's just broaden the discussion a little bit more now. All of us on this panel and in our audience will live to see AI technology really flourish in the coming decades. So right now I'll ask you to do a little sci-fi guessing. Where do you see AI technologies going that doesn't yet even exist? Don't be afraid to be creative or far-fetched. Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Shanak. Yeah.
Sure. So the first thing that I've kind of spent some time thinking about is really the educational space, because when you look at the whole classroom environment and the learning environment from like 500 years ago to today, there's not a huge difference. I'm sure you've even seen some quotes by Prince EA about the same sort of thing on how the classroom hasn't changed, and that really is true. And kind of looking at that from a technological standpoint, there's a huge potential for AI to really come and saturate that space. And that's where the whole intelligence aspect comes in. So using AI and machine learning and all of that to understand how does each student actually learn, and what types of weaknesses and strengths do they have, using some sort of pattern recognition system that AI has to offer. And then using those insights as a feedback to the students and the teachers and administration and all the different stakeholders involved to really make that learning and teaching process as efficient as it can be. So that's one huge potential that I see. The second one is healthcare. There's a lot of work that's been done on the diagnostic forefront, but integrating AI in healthcare into our day-to-day lives, so we interact with AI on a day-to-day basis. That isn't really there a whole lot. It is there with stuff like Apple Health and all of that, but it's not there, and there's a huge potential for that I also see in the future. So yeah.
Yeah, Asmain, you wanted to jump in as well?
Yeah, I think, adding on to a lot of the stuff that Shanak said, part of what artificial intelligence I'm definitely confident and will be used in the future is for the aiding of making scientific discoveries that humans otherwise just wouldn't have the ability to make. Because artificial intelligence really, when you look into the math of it at its very core, as Shanak has been mentioning, it's just a very, very fancy pattern recognition system. It's we heard some other panelists a little bit earlier talking about regression models and all of those different statistical models that AI uses, which are really, at the end of the day, ways of finding patterns, right? And I think the beautiful thing about science and the beautiful thing about the human brain and its way to make discoveries is that all we're really here to do is find patterns in the universe and then use them to our advantage, whether that's out in finding, I'm sure Brandon will have some stuff to say about dark matter research, but I think there are a lot of things that happen in our universe today that traditional models of, or even methods of scientific discovery are not able to show us. And by using artificial intelligence to either simulate or even start recognizing some of these patterns could allow us to understand a lot more about the universe than we currently know, not just in, fields like astrophysics, but also in medicine, right? The thing about medicine is it's all just chemical reactions that cause different patterns to occur within our bodies. And who knows, maybe the next drug for cancer research or the next drug for cancer treatment will be discovered by an artificial intelligence system that, by running a neural network on some chemical reactions, figures out, oh, if you combine these drugs together, you know, there is an interesting thing that happens that allows us to combat this disease.
And that's really the power of AI. There's a lot of power to discover because you can run all these tests, all these experiments virtually that it might take a human years to complete, while an AI can do it in maybe even days. So that's really where the power of AI comes from. What about you, Brendan? Where do you see AI going that we can't really envision just yet?
So I'll mention one thing that I'm excited about and one thing that I'm scared about. On the positive side, reinforcement learning, there's a lot of really cool things happening in that space. So long-term planning and that sort of thing. Because if you think about like a lot of existing reinforcement learning, which you know the AI that plays video games and that kind of thing, like AlphaGo, all that stuff you've heard about. There's a lot of work being done in like trying to dig deeper beyond just optimizing for playing a game and trying to figure out what exactly humans are motivated by, like what motivates humans to be curious and to explore and to learn. And all those things don't always map really well onto current AI systems, which are more about optimizing a predefined goal. So I'm excited about that, about the potential for unsupervised exploration, which could apply to robotics, you know, could apply to almost anything. And on the more pessimistic side, I'm sure most of you have heard about Cambridge Analytica, which was a big example of data analytics and machine learning being used to manipulate people's political views with essentially propaganda, except very targeted propaganda. And unfortunately, targeted advertising, that's a big part of what like Google and Facebook
they're massive data sets, right?
And I can only foresee that getting worse, you know, whether or not like we're going to get to the point where almost anyone who has the wrong motivations can potentially influence a large number of people very quickly. So that's something to watch out for.
Well, just to touch on that concern a little bit. So AI will obviously be so integrated in our daily lives, everything from our lecture halls and classrooms to maybe even emergency rooms, like we talked about earlier. Do you think there should be a limit though? And should there be one, like a limit where we have too much integration? Is there a line that must be drawn in the sand?
Do you want me to go?
That's yeah, all right, no worries, Brendan. That's a really, really good question. I think in terms of the concept of drawing a line in the sand and separating, you know, what humans should or should not be able to do with our advancements in technology, artificial intelligence is just like any other technology, which is really just a tool, right? It's a tool for humans to do what they believe they need to do. That's what any tool is developed to do, whether it was from the invention of fire, you know, tens of thousands of years ago when humans learned to harness that and turn it into a tool for cooking and self-defense and other things, to now artificial intelligence, which is a really fancy tool for pattern recognition and doing a lot of things that we were previously unable to do. I think it lies in the hands of the user to decide what should or should not be done with the technology. And obviously, with any human civilization, there will be users who have malicious intent behind the system, or users that, you know, aren't able to foresee the consequences of what they've built. And I think what needs to happen in the space of artificial intelligence, that has happened in a lot of other places in the technology sector, but not really quite in the corner that we're finding ourselves with machine learning, is more regulation and more attention from governments to guide the direction in which innovation goes. Because at the end of the day, you know, we're really, really lucky to live in a democracy, and there are a lot of other democratic countries out there where the will of the people decides what society's resources should be used to do and which direction technology and the tools that we're developing should push us into. And I think without making those decisions at a regulatory level, we get into a dangerous place where it's a free for all for whoever wants to use the tool in whatever way they want to use it. And I think big tech has been a great example of this, you know, and often sometimes a terrifying example of this, of the power behind big data. You know, Brandon just mentioned Cambridge Analytica, right? The fact that there were not enough regulations in the space of election predicting and election swinging to guide the process to be beneficial for humanity rather than just a place for powerful and smart people to swoop in and influence the minds of unsuspecting citizens, I think should be a lesson to us and to governments that not only do we need to pay more attention here, but we need to step in and start regulating this field more.
Yeah, great answer. Shinok, do you have any ideas of where that line can be drawn? Of course, it isn't black and white, right? Like, it's not a super clearly defined line. So just building on what Asmain said, of course, there are so many different concerns about privacy and security. Is there a limit in your mind? Like, can you try and articulate where we can say this is okay, but this is not okay?
No. So the short answer is no. I like you kind of answered the question yourself that no black and white answers. So it's almost impossible for me to say where I think that line should be. But at the same time, with stuff like defense and like the military space, where implementing AI and machine learning in those sort of industries isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially when you're looking at the defense side of things and not the offense side of things. And for example, like identifying foreign aircrafts or missile detection and using AI for that sort of thing isn't necessarily harmful. But of course, when you think of AI being used on the offensive side of things, it can it has a potential of getting out of hand. But ultimately, I think a greater answer to that question, or I guess a greater way to address that the sort of idea and these sort of thoughts, is really having an open communication between the public and the end user, which is the public, and the controller of the AI. So what I mean by that, just like Asmain was talking about, AI should be used as a tool for pattern recognition. But there's always that group of people that don't use it as a tool. They just let AI find those patterns themselves, and it has whatever impact. And as Brendan was talking about Cambridge Analytica, with it having the same impact on manipulating those groups of people. So having that one interface of humans that actually look at the insights produced by whatever AI and machine learning tools that you're using, and then that group of humans deciding, okay, here's what us humans are going to do with these machine created insights. That's something that definitely has to be there. And the communication between that human interface and whatever regulatory policy there is as it relates to AI, I think that will be the robust framework that needs to be there for there to be an ethical use, a sustained ethical use of AI in whatever application you're thinking about.
Well, those are all like such important concerns that I'm sure the rest of us all share. But in many cases, those types of concerns, whether surrounding privacy or things like location data, search histories, all of that data coming together, there are so many concerns around that, right? But in some instances, that almost runs counter to technological progress. So how do we as a society and how do businesses really reconcile the two of those if they seem to be opposite? Brendan, you want to take that?
So actually, just to briefly touch on the last question, I think if there is a line, we've already passed it. I'm not too worried about humans being integrated with AI. I think it's pretty well established that humans will pretty well give their data to the AI. I mean, you know, Facebook and like all social media is basically built around that. So in terms of like balancing progress with societal values, I think regulation is the only way to do it. This might be a bit of a hot take, but I think that targeted advertising should be totally illegal, period, because it's just been shown to be able to do a lot of harm, and I don't really think it does any good. So, you know, Google and Facebook are always kind of optimizing for their own, you know, profit, which doesn't really line up with, I think, what we want as a society. So what the European Union's doing with cracking down on data collection and making it available to the users, that's a good step. But I think the governments in general across the world need to really step up before this goes too far.
Yeah, so really your answer is there has to be strong regulation, right, to prevent companies like Facebook and Google from using that data for things like targeted advertising. As Main and Schnock, would you really agree with that?
You know what? I think I agree with that. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Brennan's point is a very, very interesting one to contemplate, because this isn't the first time that human society has faced an industry that has the potential for rapid change and progress, but also incredible harm. I mean, if you look at the medical industry, which, you know, a couple hundred years ago didn't really exist in the form that it does today, but now we have a very strong regulation system surrounding drugs and clinical trials, and the regulatory boards that each single drug has to pass through in order to gain, you know, FDA approval or whatever regulatory body you're talking about. So I don't think it's a completely unfamiliar problem to us to have a sector of technology in which governments have to step in to make those regulations. So I am optimistic about the fact that governments will eventually realize to step in. But I think the only way in which that happens is if young people like us who understand the implications of this technology choose to go into government and start becoming the regulators. Because I think time and time again, we've seen that the, you know, more seasoned, more experienced, older people, whatever you want to call them, if you want to call them boomers, then go for it. But, you know, they simply haven't had the exposure nor the, I guess, understanding of what technology can really do and the rapid pace at which it's transforming the lives of millennials and Gen Zs and younger generations, if not paid attention to. And I think you saw that in the congressional hearings that were held a while back about Facebook, where Congress people were asking Facebook some really absurd questions that didn't really make any sense. And so you realize that, wow, governments don't have any experience with this.
There
and
is
so
a bit of a divide there,
Yeah, need to step up.
Yeah. Sorry to skip you here for Schnock, but we don't have much time, so I'd like to move on to the next question. So on the topic of legislation, like you said, Esme, so often it lags behind technological process. So many people have called for something like a privacy-focused set of laws to act as a foundation for the future that really, regardless of short-term technological progress, will still stand. So do you think something like a standard federal privacy laws and data security laws are really necessary, and how might that affect AI developments? Schnock, you can start us off there.
Yeah, sure. Well, quick answer, yeah, they're definitely necessary, and how they might affect AI development. I don't think it's going to stunt growth, because the whole purpose of having the regulation and policy is in place is to not have bad people do bad things. But on from a more nuanced perspective, it's to, really stop that, but also, this is interesting.
It's a tough topic to tackle for sure.
Yeah, because having that sort of regulation in place is just going to restrict the boundaries of growth in AI. It's going to make sure that for the long term, you're going to have AI that doesn't invade someone's privacy and that doesn't make use of user information in some sort of malicious way that's going to lead to some sort of something like targeted advertisement or whatever malicious intent that you want to call it. So yeah, that regulation is definitely necessary, and I don't think it's going to stunt growth. It's just going to
grow in a different way, I guess.
Yeah, like appropriately restrict growth so it's ethical.
Yeah, as as part of Popular, that's really one of your goals, right? To track all of that data while also promoting data privacy, right? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I think me personally, and I think a lot of people on this panel are very strong believers in individual privacy, and we see the dangers of what happens when large corporations get their hands on large data sets and then are able to do whatever they want with it. And recognizing the problems that can arise for users and society at large because of that. At Popular, the models that we develop in order to predict markets by analyzing all of these different data points about people and their behavior and what they're influenced by, we don't actually make predictions on an individual user basis. So in a lot of ways, if you think about it like advertising, we don't target you specifically. Instead, what we do is we identify certain characteristics about you that line up with other people in a large aggregate group. And then we categorize you into specific different archetype groups. based
really
on
the
who you are
population
and
as a whole,
what
right?
similar people exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're making predictions about the groups of people that have similar characteristics rather than the individuals themselves, which not only allows us to look at fewer data points on the individual level, because what we can really do is instead of looking at you and finding 100 different data points about you, we can find 5 different data points about you and then 5 from several other people similar to you. So with 20 people, we have the same data points, right? And so as a result of that, we're able to zoom out, but still make relevant predictions that businesses can use without actually knowing really too much about you yourself and more about people similar to your archetype group.
Yeah, interesting answer. Brendan, sorry I don't give you an opportunity to respond here. I think we can squeeze in one more question before we transition to the Q&A. So I want to ask one related to startups and entrepreneurship to our future innovators. So startups, especially with the rise of the internet, have really gotten more numerous than ever, and there have been several very high profile ones. However, we also have major technology conglomerates like Facebook and Alphabet that often buy up those startups and really take over them. However, they have much greater financial and human capital, of course, because they are so big. I'd like to ask you three to all make a bit of a value judgment here. When it comes to AI, is one better suited, so either conglomerates or startups, better suited to innovate and also to reconcile the social concerns that we previously discussed? Brendan, you can start us off.
That's a good question. I think to some extent, they serve different functions. Startups are mostly based around like finding, a very specific, well-defined problem that we can solve with machine learning, and then, implementing a solution and selling it. And that's great. I think startups can do that better than the big companies in many ways. What big companies like Google and Facebook have is the resources to do more on the pure research side. So if you look at Google Brain, a lot of the stuff they're doing is almost more comparable to the research people do at universities than it is to anything a startup would do. Because Google has, effectively infinite resources, they can take on a lot of long-term projects that have, like a 10-year, sorry if I have background noise, a 10-year life cycle, rather than, a startup that has to have something ready in 2 years. So they play kind of different roles in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so I'll just cut you off there. I want to give Asmain and Shinnok an opportunity to respond as well. So just relatively brief responses from the two of you, please. Asmain, you want to go first?
Sure. I think I fully agree with Brendan here. I think he hit the nail right on. And I think, working at a startup myself, it's not even 2-year time spans that we're operating in. We're mostly operating in almost like 2-week to 2-month time spans usually. And the thing about startups is the pressure to constantly survive. And I think that forces us to focus on short-term problems with big payouts rather than long-term problems. And I think Brandon is completely right in what he's saying.
Nice. What about you, Shinnok?
Yeah, sure. I might hold a different view on this because I kind of follow the mentality that you should go slow, but go long. Like there's like do what you're doing. But of course, a startup is in a unique position where, especially those that are not run by an investor board, so they don't have pushing from some of their investors saying that, hey, this is like who you're going to work with, this is the work that you're going to do, and like get this done in this sort of time frame. Those sort of startups have the liberty of going slow, but also going long and creating some sort of product or service that is sustainable, but that can also adapt to whatever the changing circumstances are in like our human environment. But Brendan brought up a good point that the larger companies have those infinite resources to conduct that state-of-the-art research that startups simply can't, especially the ones that don't go slow and go long. So there's definitely a balance on who's best suited for the growth of AI. They're just, in different respects.
I suppose no matter what, we'll end up having both. We'll continue to have startups, we'll also continue to have conglomerates. So I guess in a way, we get a bit of both worlds there. So that wraps up our 30-minute panel discussion. We're a couple minutes over time in our bit of a delayed schedule. I think I can speak for all of the audience in saying that this was very fascinating and insightful hearing from the three of you. So we'll now have about a 15-minute Q&A. I've seen some questions in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and pick out a few to ask you guys. So just to get over a few of the questions in the short time we have here, I'd like to ask you guys to just limit your responses a little bit more. I know you have a lot of ideas, but just kind of keep it nice and brief. So Vesa asked in the chats, there are many generational differences in how we tackle AI and tech problems. So if one generation has a different view than the other, is there any way that we can reconcile that, granted that we live in the same society?
I think one field that's very relevant to this question is consulting, because you have that generation that is like, hey, we don't know anything about technology, and then you have like us, which were like, hey, we know everything about technology, and that's where consulting comes in. You're like, hey, we are the consultants, like we're going to help you old people understand stuff to do with your data. But yeah, and that's something that's definitely going to be there. But increasing that like data literacy amongst all generations is something like I'm a huge advocate of, because everybody should have some sort of sense of what data do they have and what exactly they can do with their data. Of course, there's some people that are experts in it, but everybody having that basis is good.
Yeah, I suppose no matter what, there will be some people with a lot of knowledge and then some people with the opposite almost. What about you, Asmain and Brendan? Any quick responses to add to that?
Brendan, I'll let you go.
Sure. Okay. I guess I'd say the biggest thing is that our generation has more firsthand experience with things like social media, which are some of the main applications of AI. So in that sense, we have a more visceral idea of what it looks like in practice. Beyond that, I'm not sure I have a great answer for that question.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'll move on to the next question then. More on a personal level for the three of you. What are your future plans, whether that's AI related or not? So what are you doing in university, and what are your plans for the workplace? Asmain, you can start us off there.
All right, sounds good. Well, for me, really, it's just about being curious and seeing where that curiosity takes me. So I'm taking a gap year at the moment. And I think what I'll do during the gap year is reapply to some universities to see where open doors lie, and then figure out with the startup how things are going after we cross some of the funding rounds that we're currently in. And then if things really start to take off, I think down the road, I'll reevaluate and see where I can create the most value for myself and for society, and where I'll be the happiest. And then I think we'll go from there.
Yeah, Shinak, you're taking a gap year as well, I think.
Yeah, you're correct. I am taking a gap year. I'm going to be focusing the gap year mainly on one thing, well, as of today, mainly on one thing, which is the educational intelligence side of things, because I just see so much potential. I've already started some work, and it's pretty promising on how we can use AI in that space. So I'll be focusing on that. Some other work really to automate the data reporting process, on helping clients find their own insights from whatever data that they have access to. And that's kind of bridging that generational difference that we talked about a while ago. But those are my main two plans. And then, of course, I'll be attending Stanford, and I'll do further that interest in CS, and also look at the management side and the policy side of things as well. So, yeah.
Okay. What about you, Brendan? You're attending university in the fall, right?
Yeah, I'm starting at Stanford in a couple of weeks. So I'm really excited for that, to get to know the professors and researchers studying AI at Stanford. I'm working on lately some natural language processing projects on personality modeling and that space, which I haven't really done before. So that's exciting. And in general, I've always wanted to at some point start my own company. So I guess that's kind of a long-term goal. I'm not sure on what yet, but I'll, figure it out as I go.
You'll definitely be in the right place for it.
For sure, yeah. So one more really final question, brief responses, please. How might students looking to get into AI, whether that's in high school or maybe even younger, how do they find opportunities to get involved? If someone jump in, feel free.
All right. Talk to the people here, honestly. Some of the panelists, I'm sure their Instagrams are on the AI4Youth tagged, right? Like if you guys are watching right now and you're like, I really want to get into this, this is exciting for me, pick one person or two people that you heard speaking here today that like really inspired you or said something really interesting. And honestly, just go hit them up on social media and start talking, because like the amount of stuff you'll learn once you just jump into the research of it is absolutely insane. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really not as hard as it appears to be at first.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Shinnok? Any advice to get involved?
Yeah, I would just say keep an open mind, keep an open mentality. There's a like for me right now, there's still a lot out there that I don't know, and for a lot of students here, there's a lot out there that they don't know. And keeping their eyes open, just really just doing research online. It's not that hard to do. If you're interested in something and you're like, hey, AI seems cool, do some research on AI, and then delve deep into it wherever you feel like delving deep. And that's going to make you happy. That made me happy, and that's why I'm still doing it, and I'm still
Mm-hmm.
happy. So that's good.
Yeah. What about you, Brendan?
So yeah, I'll echo Asmain and Shinnok. Google's great. You know, there's lots of good resources online. In particular, I'll call out, there's this course on Coursera by Stanford professor Andrew Ng, Andrew NG, which I took back in a few years ago. Fantastic introduction to the math and implementation of machine learning. It's from 2010, so it's not super recent, but I very, very much recommend that you take that course online. It's a great down-to-earth introduction to AI.
I second that. It's a really good course.
Yeah, so online courses, get in touch with people that might know about AI. Just feel free to contact any of the three panelists we have here today. I'm sure they'd be glad to help you guys. And that concludes our Q&A and the student panel. So thank you everyone for attending this panel. It's been a joy to moderate this discussion, and I hope you all enjoyed hearing the thoughts of Brendan, Asmain, and Shinnok. It's really been great learning from them, and I'm sure you guys feel the same way. So we'll now have a short break, and our next panel will begin soon. Jordan, my partner from AI4Youth, will have some more information about that. Goodbye for now.
Thank you so much to our moderator, Nicholas Wilger, and all of our amazing student panelists today, Brendan, Asmain, and Shinnok. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We're gonna have a 5-minute bio break, and then we're gonna be starting our next exciting panel, Ethics and Security, moderated by MIT graduate and product manager at Microsoft, Brooke Kiffel. And just everyone remember to sign up for the workshop with braintoy.ai. You can find all of the information in the link in the chat.
Alrighty, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We're back from our break. Up next, our first deep dive panel will be about the topic of approaching the digital, political, and physical issues that arrive in an AI-driven world. Where do we draw the line between human and machine? This ethics and security and privacy panel will be moderated by product manager at Microsoft, socio-technologist, MIT graduate with a bachelor's and master's in computer science with a concentration in AI, Brooke Kiffel. Brooke and panelists, thank you so much for coming. Hopefully the trip here wasn't too tiring, and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the wonderful introduction, Jonathan. Can you guys hear me? Just confirming.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, I'm super excited to be here with you all today and to be joined by a very wonderful panel of experts in industry and academia, really comprised of really amazing researchers and engineers and entrepreneurs. So as Jonathan said, my name is Brooke, and I'm super excited to be moderating this panel on ethics and security and privacy, which is one of the most important and very critical aspects of this new generation of AI development. And so, a little about the goal for the session. We really hope to inspire and encourage the audience to not just get involved in AI, but to do so in a way that responsibly thinks about, user privacy, data privacy, security, ethics, fairness. So the way we'll structure this session will be, introduction of our awesome panelists, followed by about 40 minutes of Q&A, of structured Q&A, where we have some set questions for our panelists until a little after 4:30. And then the final 15 minutes will be reserved for live Q&A with the audience. So please do follow along. And we hope that you'll use this as an opportunity to ask the panelists some very insightful and thought-provoking questions. So with that, I'll introduce our lineup of panelists. So to start off, we have Jay Satropa. So Jay Sutropa is the Land and Joint Chief Engineer at General Dynamics, Mission Systems Canada. He has responsibility for providing both domestic and international customers with solutions and products. Throughout his time with General Dynamics, he's led the technical team, working jointly with DLC SPM at Multinational Experiment 4, a coalition technical exercise with US and British partners. Jay was also a member of the Bowman program team, which is the British Army, where he was responsible for several middleware subsystems designed specifically for the challenges of the harsh mobile tactile environment. Up next, we have Stephen Ibaraki. Stephen is chairman and managing general partner at Reds Capital. In addition, Stephen has very globally unique chairman, founder, and board member roles in business and startups, successful entrepreneurship, investment, VC firms, global computing science organizations, UN-related innovation programs, think tanks, summits. Really, he's a keynote speaker, he's a moderator, he's a producer at more than 100 global CEO and leader events, and has exemplified excellence in this field with over 18 global Microsoft awards, including 15 Microsoft MVP awards, of which he was recently awarded one on July 1st, 2020. So super excited to have Stephen with us. Up next, we have Quinn Underwood, who's an entrepreneur, global health researcher, and author. He's the former co-founder and director of global business development for Advin, which is a health tech company he helped scale across Bangladesh and India, growing the team to more than 20 and serving more than 150,000 patients during his time. Quinn currently serves as the CEO of Animo, which is a privacy-first platform built to help individuals and organizations measure and predict their psychological well-being through the use of AI. Up next, we have Oldu Karimi, Dr. Oldu Karimi, who's a data network specialist. Earlier in her career, she joined the networking industry and spent some time really building products, introducing very cutting-edge new networking solutions to providers in Asia and Europe and North America and South America. So really having a wide global experience. She's currently a lecturer and chair of the diversity committee at the computing science department at Simon Fraser University. And her current interests include virtualization at the end. In addition to her contributions as an academic, she's very passionate about computing education and societal problems, including fair access. And then up, last but not least, we have Saqib Mohammed, who is co-founder at Resemble, working on creating custom AI voices that capture human emotion. Saqib previously worked at Pantera Capital, Passport Capital, and Contrarian Capital. He also previously founded Token Herd, which is a management platform for crypto and splash teas. He graduated from McMaster University with a degree in commerce. So we have a very awesome lineup of speakers. We're very excited to have them. So I'll start off our first question directed to Stephen, actually, who has such a very wide experience across multiple organizations in different capacities, as I said, as a chairman, as a founder, as a board. So given your impressive resume and impressive experience with all these organizations, what over your time have you identified as being some of the promises, but also some of the threats of AI? And how would you generally advise companies to best ensure user privacy and user safety through integrating AI into their products and services?
So, Brooke, let's start with the end first. And what I would recommend is really joining organizations or associations, for example, or following things like the Partnership on AI. Microsoft has something called the AI Business School, which has information on responsible AI. There's a partnership with Harvard University on protected sensitive information. There's also a UN program called AI4Youth, and they have a data commons to ensure good data and so on. From a corporate standpoint and game changers and startups, there's a group called CV Insights. I really recommend you follow them. And they come out every year with them game changers. So one of the ones they put out is AI transparency and major trends. And an example company would be like Darwin AI with generative synthesis and so on. So what are the pros and what are the cons? Well, I mean, the cons or the challenges are tremendous, right? I mean, facial recognition and being screen scraped or taken off social media sites, and then delving into you in ways so you can't even imagine, or maybe this idea of tracking you because of social credit, developing some kind of social credit score, or there's this idea of even contact tracing because of this COVID situation. What if personally identifiable information was being shared in some way? And what does that mean? And so there's also the privacy, security aspects and concerns. And keep in mind that I estimate something like you have to now monitor 35 billion security events per day just to keep on top of it. So you definitely need AI for that. With anticipated losses of about 6 trillion a year and so on. So it's a lot of negatives, including fake news and how do you determine what's real and what's not. The positives is that you can get all sorts of insights into better nutrition, better healthcare, better well-being, insights into things like the better use of the different products and services you have if you're a company. So, there's a lot of positives as well. And in my opinion, positives exceed the negatives.
Definitely. And I think that's, shifting the way of thinking from dwelling just on, the threats, but also thinking about some of the potential benefits that can be reaped from these technologies is a very important mindset that needs to be had. And I think with that, that's sort of a great transition to introduce some of the work that Saqib is doing with his organization Resemble, which he co-founded, which is really working on creating custom AI voices that capture human emotion, which is one of the many things that AI can be used to sort of accomplish. And so, Saqib, if you could just, describe a little more about your journey with this company that you founded, but specifically in pursuing some of the technology, how and what do you foresee as being potential security and privacy issues that this field might impose, and what are you doing specifically in the technology realm with this organization to create a safe environment for your users?
Yeah, thanks, Bert. I think the first thing when I tell people that hey, I work at an AI company or I found an AI company that clones voices, the radars go up and it's like, oh, okay, well, you're going to put voice actors out of business. Second thing, the deepfakes thing, which is obviously a big thing nowadays, right? But I think at the end of the day, taking a step back and looking at it from helping the creatives and people who are looking to figure out a way like, hey, how can we disrupt the current, archaic pipeline that they've been stuck with for ages? For example, when it comes to creators, when you're doing visuals, a lot of that has been automated, right? Because you're going in front of a green screen, you're fighting dragons and what have you. But for audio, you still have to go into a studio, record the content, and do anything in post-production or what have you. So that's when, we started looking at the audio side of the business and realized that was something that needed a little bit of, a push from a company perspective, because nothing had been done for a while and people were still using the older methods. And, the synthetic speech is not something that I woke up one day, I'm like, oh, it's a great idea. Nobody's done it before. It's been around forever, right? But before it was a concatenative approach. And it wasn't until long ago when, deep learning and machine learning and the computing power came a little bit more affordable in a sense that, everybody can kind of like utilize that now. So that's what we started Resemble, to help out all the, creators, entertainment people from an angle of helping them streamline their process. Now, I think the first question we get asked is that, right? Like, hey, so anybody can clone my voice and, use it for whatever reason. So when we started the company, we were pretty bent on making sure that we had like an ethics page, and, that our morals and ethics were like aligned from the beginning, like my co-founder and I, our team. At the end of the day, there's a lot to be money made if I wanted to just clone Trump's voice and sell that. And, we get more than enough requests like, hey, can I do celebrity's voice, or can I do this voice or that voice? So, most of you guys probably, know Linus. we worked with him to create a deepfake of him, Linus Tech Tips YouTube channel. And I think he was one of the moderator maybe earlier, what have you. But when we created his deepfake, his team reached out. We had his team record, like have Linus say the sentence like, I give, for example, the consent to clone my voice. Because, at the end of the day, we're trying to make sure that what the data you sent us is of the person that you're cloning the voice of is giving consent, is aware of it. Because at the end of the day, his team could have emailed us and not knowing the Linus gave his blessings to that. And once we have that in place, then there's no concept of like being used for malicious use, right? Because if you, for example, could deepfake a video and send me the audio, then I don't know why you need my services for. So those are the angles that we're looking at. So when we worked with, we've done a couple of projects with celebrities or personalities that have passed away. But that's, when we work, then we work with the foundation or the trust that owns the rights to that person, right? So it's like, for example, a celebrity and artist, the foundation is trying to bring back an exhibit at the museum. So we get the right paperwork from them, we get our counsel involved, they sign out, they look, everything checks out, and then we move on to the next stage. So, that's something that we've seen a lot of, and that's the first question that we get asked all the time, like, hey, what are you guys doing from an ethical standpoint? Because, what you're doing could be taken the wrong way. So that's the idea that we're taking. We ask people to, give a consent video that they're giving the authorization to clone their voice. And if they upload any audio data, they still have to have that consent before we can, go ahead and process that. So we put those, procedures in place after obviously running into those questions that arose, as soon as we started the company.
Definitely. And so it seems like definitely winning the trust and understanding of your customer base is a big part of being able to roll out these technologies and develop in a way that's meaningful and can actually connect with people. Great. So I think that sort of segues well into the next question I had. Jay, is Jay online? Just to confirm. Yes, and I see him. Great to have you, Jay. So, I gave an introduction to your background. I think you have a very interesting role as chief engineer at General Dynamics. And to those who, can you hear me? I don't believe you. Can you hear me? Yes, a little low, but we can hear you. So in your capacity as chief engineer at General Dynamics, which, is in the defense and aerospace industry, there's definitely a lot of conflict of interest and oftentimes thinking about what is the role of technology in the context of defense, in the context of the sort of aerospace field. Definitely a point of study and interest at MIT and other, Boeing and other large-scale defense institutions. And so, there's this underlying concern over the moral code for autonomous technologies. And the moral code that they should follow and how that will affect people in the future. And so, for example, there's the 3 laws of robotics, which define the base functionality of how robots interact with society. So one of them, or the first law, being that robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. The second being a robot must obey orders given to it by a human, except where such orders would conflict the first law. So you sort of see a point of contention there. And then the third law, which is that a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. And so there's a sort of catch-22 where all these laws kind of have a lot of dependency with one another. And so, in your role as chief engineer at General Dynamics, what is your opinion about sort of the implementation and enforcement of these ethics codes when developing sort of these cutting edge technologies that benefit society? And how do you go about in your role ensuring that these are being implemented on the ground?
Well, you highlight the fact that we're in the defense industry. So we probably have to come at these at slightly different than your normal commercial marketplace. Can you guys hear me? Sorry.
And
Jay, just to interrupt, yeah, I don't think we can quite hear you.
Sorry. I'm having a lot of technical problems. Is that better?
Yes.
So, hang on. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Apologies. The last 5 months has made me trust technology even less, having been locked down in my house by myself, having to rely on it.
And Jay, just to quickly hop in, if you could put the mic closer to your mouth,
okay.
it definitely help.
Like that?
Yeah.
Wow. Sorry. This is not normal. Yeah, as you highlighted, being in the defense industry, obviously potentially coming at this problem from a little bit of a different perspective than your normal commercial marketplace. But when I look at those three laws that were put in place, I, I, I think more of the spirit of that law, which is to put humans first. Um, whether that's your customer. Is this working? I'm apologies. I'm gonna have to reboot. I'm having trouble. I gotta.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, Jay, I believe we're having some difficulty hearing you. So, if it's okay, maybe you could try to fix. And once you have that figured out, please feel free to shout, and we'll circle back on this question because it is very interesting. In the meantime, I actually want to go on to Dr. Karimi, who has a very accomplished background as someone who's received her PhD, as someone who's worked in industry, and now serves as an academic lecturing, but also really promoting the inclusion of diverse communities in the field of computing. And so, Dr. Karimi, as an academic, but also someone with experience in industry, you play a very crucial role in educating the next generation of scientists, which is a very big responsibility, I'm sure. And so given your role in academia and in industry, and sort of as the chair of the diversity community, what are some of your concerns? What kinds of things keep you up at night, both in your research and the courses that you teach, as it relates to issues of privacy, security, and ethics?
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. Is my voice okay, or do I? Okay, perfect. So my background is in networking, computer networking. So I have worked on different number of problems that have to do with AI as well. So because like our many aspects of our lives are intertwined with AI right now. I was first introduced to AI in my undergrad studies through the AI game type of problems. And then I continued with it on using it in optimization problems when I use them in network. And currently I'm involved in it on the learning on the edge, which is like on the edge of the network, not meaning cutting edge technology, learning on the edge of the networks, and also on educating the new generation. One of the programs that we have in educating the next generation is part of the AI4All SFU, which is Invent the Future program, which we try to and educate the next generation, but and a diverse set of students coming into the AI field. So as you know, many of the problems that we have with AI and ML, they're basis in the data that we provide to these algorithms. So insufficient data, wrong data, missing data, or adversary data that is fed to these algorithms. So back to the question that you asked me about the diversity, one of the things is we have to have different types of groups designing these algorithms, so we have a good perspective of those diverse groups within these algorithms. And we also need to provide the data of those set of groups of people so that those algorithms can work for them. So in both cases, the diversity comes into this problem and also into the solution. And what keeps me awake at night is that we are very behind in terms of, I saw some of the questions that are coming in the chat box as well, being about the policies and how you decide if it's policies the best way or not. One of the things that keeps me awake at night is that if the policies are going as fast as we are going in the direction of building those algorithms, and if we are thinking on the transparency side of the algorithms that we are making, as much as we are thinking about the specific solutions that we are tackling with these algorithms. I hope that answers the question well.
Yeah, excellent. And I think that, in many ways that is a very concerning area that needs to be thought about more. And, I think going back to some of the threats and promises that Stephen had discussed, but also some of the efforts that Saqib and his team are pursuing. I think the topic of diversity is a very important aspect. Diversity in two realms. Diversity on one end is representation in the data that's being used to develop these models, but also diversity on the teams. So how can you have more people on your VC teams, on your startup teams, on your board that really represent a diverse perspective of racial, ethnic, gender, religious, so on and so forth. Recently, large companies like Microsoft and IBM and Amazon drew back their face recognition technologies because the data that they were being trained on had discriminated against people who were darker skinned, against females. And so, having the diversity, not just in the data sets, but the diversity in the teams to call out those issues is a very important thing. And so, Dr. Karimi, Saqib, working in your capacity as a startup founder, developing technologies using rich data sets, and then also Stephen as a board member, as a founder, as a chairman, as someone who's very involved in these conversations. How important is diversity on whatever aspect, whether it be gender, racial, background, whatever, is that kind of diversity on your team, but also in the data sets and the engineering sort of that's being used to develop these technologies in hopes to address the issue of ethics and fairness. And so, Dr. Karimi, you can sort of go into that from an academic point of view and your role as an instructor, as a researcher, and then I'd really like Saqib to talk about his experiences as a startup founder, and then also Stephen in your capacity as well.
As I mentioned previously, one of our goals as the educator is that to have that education start that pipeline very early. So what we offer as part of the outreach programs that we have at the university is to reaching to grade 10 and 11 of young women that want to start learning about AI. And that is through Invent the Future program. So that is one of aspects of the activities that we are putting towards that. Another, again, as my role as an educator is to not only teach the technology that is involved in building these products, because that is going to be evolved, also learning about what kind of transparent principles that you have to put in learning and also implementing those products, because we are educating the next generation that are going to build even more complex products than we are seeing today. So being transparent and having set out those principles for that advancement is very important too, and we are trying to address and as early as possible.
Excellent. And Saqib?
Yeah, I think I can, touch up based on it from a twofold perspective, from a company and then obviously the data sets that we use. Yeah, from a company standpoint, I think as you mentioned, diversity, I think it is its core for you have an organization where a lot of people have different ideas and can share what they've learned or what they want the company to go forward with. So for example, our company, even though we're pretty heavy on AI research, it's very diversified from the employee standpoint. So some of our employees, have backgrounds in ML research that have done their masters in AI, but some of them are audio-based guys, right? It's because they just done audio production, because most of the time we need audio help from that angle as well. So it's just not about like somebody that has AI experience. It's anybody that can fit that role. And some of them, two of our team members are self-taught developers, right? They're not even like people who went to computer science. They did, I think, music or something. They just found this interesting and said, hey, this is what we wanted to learn. So that helps from that angle. So then we're trying to like experiment as well with different approaches. So for example, right now, without naming the rap group, we're working with like I think I want to say 90s, early 2000 rap group to synthesize one of their the rapper's voice and then create like a rap song from it. And again, if we just had researchers that are heavy on like like, hey, okay, machine learning is the way it goes, that probably wouldn't see the day of light. But the fact that we have people who come from different backgrounds, especially music, that helps us with tackling those experiments and coming up with new ways to address the problems. From a data set standpoint, I think we've been fortunate in the sense that we can clone any voices with any accents. So we haven't been able, we haven't run into that issue yet. So from the start, the way we structured our platform was when somebody's cloning their voice, you want to retain their voice as close as possible because the accent is part of that identity. So, when we built the model, we built the tech, that was something that, we focused on from the get-go. But I think to your point, I feel like diversity data set is obviously a big issue. I've seen a lot of companies that, for example, the facial recognition thing that you mentioned right now. I remember, I want to say 3-4 years ago, was that Microsoft chatbot Tay, if I recall, right? Same thing happened there. When it came out, it was like, oh, this is the best next thing. And then people started realizing that, okay, this is not, something that we should be, should be releasing that early, I guess, because it wasn't trained the right data sets. And same thing with, GPT-3, right, that OpenAI just released. Again, it's crazy how, innovative and smart, I guess you could say, that AI is, but then you try to give it some data set and you can see some, nuances over there too. So, I mean, without going into too much detail, there's, more than enough examples on Twitter that people can find, whether it was related to like religion or, again, ethnicities. Some of those answers are like, okay, it definitely was trained on something that, if a person was doing it, they would have extracted the data and not use it from that angle. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done from that angle. But, I think as we obviously, the technology gets better and people get more familiarized on how they want to tackle that, hopefully, it won't be before long that, we can train models that are encompasses of all different data sets that capture whatever you're trying to accomplish.
Excellent. And I think that, there certainly is a lot more work to be done. And I definitely do encourage, the audience members to learn a little more about the case studies and examples of, times where technology has gone left, where it hasn't, operated as expected. And so the chatbot, the face recognition technologies, because I think there's a lot to be learned, not just from, successful technology, but also technology that fails and why it fails. And so with that, I want to continue with Stephen to share his perspective across the board as well.
So I'll give you a global perspective. There's actually over 100 AI ethical frameworks in existence right now. And what I mean by ethical frameworks, I'm talking about things like accountability, responsibility, transparency, fairness, equity, ethics, explainability, interpretability, contestability, privacy, and human control. All of those encompassed within these ethical frameworks. Now, where do they exist? Well, the European Union has one. They released one last year. The OECD, UNESCO, Canada, Singapore, Australia, the G7 have a global partnership on AI. And then let's say you're a company, you want to take account all of these aspects of ethical framework, which includes diversity. Well, there's the IEEE P7000 operational framework. So if you're going to do some coding, you can follow that framework, or the ACM Code of Ethics, or there's an ISO standard. It's a really long designation, but it's an ISO IEC 42 standard on artificial intelligence. There's an organization called IFIP, which is a Federation of Computing Organizations, also has a global code of ethics and so on. So there's a lot of work being done, including with CEOs, because I work across CEO clusters. Last year, more than 180 CEOs indicated that it's not just about shareholder value, but it's about diversity and across multiple stakeholders. I work with another group of CEOs, 30,000 of them, definitely diversity, inclusion, and all of those aspects of ethical frameworks are an important part of their work. In fact, they're holding a summit this year. And there's a group of CEOs out of Orange County. It's called the CEO Leadership Alliance. And again, diversity, inclusion, they're creating an AI super hub, and all of these aspects of ethical frameworks are an important aspect of what they're doing. A lot out there.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that really sheds light on, the breadth of efforts that have been, the breadth and depth of efforts that have been instituted to, create some sort of standard across the industry to address these problems. But I think there's also a very central role that academic training should play in educating, the next generation of leaders and scientists to think more critically about these issues. And so we have some questions coming in. Please feel free to continue to add them. We will transition to the Q&A in about 15 minutes. But in the meantime, I really wanted to continue to dig a little deeper on this education component. So, Dr. Creamy, in your capacity, Saqib, you talked about, two of your own team members not having a formal educational background. And so, there's definitely a varying depth and breadth of the kinds of expertise or background you can have or necessarily need to be working in the space. But specifically, considering that most of the audience members will be going to, 4-year undergraduate programs, whether it be in Canada or abroad, to those who do have a traditional engineering or science education, what are the gaps in the current education system? So Dr. Creamy, you can talk about this as an educator, but Saqib and Stephen as founders, as employers of the youth, where are the gaps? And should something akin to the ethics or philosophy of AI be taught in schools? If yes, if no, how can these new incoming students approach their education to really be trained to think about these issues very critically?
Should I start first, or?
Yes, please do start.
So as you already mentioned, like there is a breadth and there is a depth of the knowledge that we are seeing and using here. So on the breadth, because these algorithms basically can be applied in different set of disciplines that we have right now. We started seeing it in natural language processing, image processing. Those are more known set of disciplines that we see, but we are seeing it in many other places, like in fashion and like networking, which is my field, like very diverse across the spectrum. So because we have a lot of tools available for tools, and also many of the organizations are making the education available in the AI, it is, I'm thinking the pool of resources available to people wanting to apply it to that breadth set of the disciplines is pretty good. But the depth education, which is like the background that comes in with the engineering and science, that part of it is part of our educational system to more focus on. And so again, as I mentioned, one of the things that we are seeing that the development in these, because we have applications that we want to solve specific problems for, but before solving those specific problems, we do not see the other uses that could be made of these algorithms that we are developing for them. So adversarial parts of the those algorithms that we are developing are usually found after. So for example, in the GDPR case, we were using and making our data available for a very long time before we had those guidelines of data coming in. So that gap, I would say, is catching up with the advancement of the technology, with the advancement of how we secure that technology for the use cases that we have.
Definitely. Excellent. Okay. And Saqib, could you also comment on that? Based off as you grow your team, how these considerations are important, and how much a formal computing education is integral to the work that you do, and where are the gaps, and how what is a very holistic, well-rounded applicant or employee that you would want to employ in your company or organization?
Yeah, I think my answer would have been different if everybody on the panel had already graduated, but most of, I think it's catered towards students. So my, response would be a little bit different because I worked in the Bay Area for about, 5 years, and the thinking there is different about how education plays a big role. And I think it's, I know in Canada, we've always been very risk averse, and that's probably not, and that's why I had to leave Canada to go to US to work at hedge funds, because we didn't have a lot to work. We didn't have a lot of hedge funds or venture capitals, to work over here. But I think, education itself, one thing that has become very normal now, it's a lot of resources available online, right? Whether it's I think Coursera, which was mentioned on the last panel by Brandon, I believe, the courses there, right? And there's Udacity and what have you. There's just an abundance of stuff out there that people can just, learn on their own. And you don't have to pay anything for it, which is the most amazing thing nowadays, right? You're literally taking courses from MIT, Stanford, Harvard, like the computer science course, CS50, I believe it's called, right? Like I don't come from a tech background, but I pretty much self-taught everything, as I started the company and as I was working at venture capital in my past life. So I think now as an applicant, we're more looking at does the person understand on what we're trying to do? And it's not more about like, oh, tell me how the courses you took back in like your undergrad, or if that was the case, then our team wouldn't be the way it is right now, or you wouldn't be at the headcount that we are currently at. And I think for us, mostly on like, can you understand what we're trying to do here, and can you showcase that we have done something, right? So for example, the people that I mentioned that we hired that didn't have the background, we looked at, okay, they have open source stuff. Like, that's what we took as, okay, they know what they're talking about. And that was our reference for them, right? So I think it comes down to, what, I guess what you're trying to do. And I think that's why I feel like, especially students nowadays have a lot more resources if you find the right, I guess, guidance as well. I think the education system still has a little bit of, I guess you could say tinkering to do with it, to tell students, okay, if this is what you want to do, this is the path you should be taking. Because sometimes, you don't need to be studying a computer science or whatever you're taking for 4 years. You graduate and then, 2 years later, you're like, I hate this. I don't want to do this, and I've seen that more than enough times, right? So I think, the availability that's available, like the courses that are available right now online, are a pretty good resources for people to figure out, okay, what, do I actually enjoy this? Like, for example, artificial intelligence, you just take that course by Andrew Ng, you're like, I don't get it, right? So it's like, okay, cool, then we move on. You find something else. Or, there's a channel on YouTube called, I think, 3 Blue, 2 Brown, or 2 Blue, 1 Brown, or something like that. It's about mathematics, right? It's this guy that graduated from Stanford. Now he's made a channel just explaining math equations, and there's stuff on, artificial intelligence, deep learning, math for that. So a lot of these resources are already available out there. And I think it's just for the students to find out, how can we like take advantage of those? And just as my last point on how education can be different for everybody, at my previous firm at Pantera, we had, 2 guys that we hired from MIT. They dropped out at first year, right? Because they're like, well, we know already enough about blockchain and cryptocurrency and programming that we don't need to, keep studying for 3 years at MIT. So I think it all just depends on what you're trying to figure out and where you are in life. And I think that kind of, and that kind of guides you on, what you want to do after you're done school, or, you drop out after first year, like, hey, I already know enough. I don't need school. So it all depends. Not that I would recommend anybody dropping out. Please don't take at face value. I don't want, messages after from parents who are like, hey, what is this guy doing?
Yeah, definitely, different ways, different paths to getting towards very similar destinations. Some of the greatest innovators and problem solvers in the world, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, were college dropouts. But that's not to say that dropping out of college is the way to do it. Pursuing education can definitely provide a lot of value to you, and the resources and the environment of being surrounded by very talented people can be. And I see Dr. Creamy shaking her head, so I'm glad we got the support there. Stephen, I actually wanted to circle back with you, but actually to ask a slightly different question. So, I'm looking at the chat, and, there's a couple questions that have come up regarding, an internationally recognized set of AI ethics frameworks. And you have that globe sort of in your screen in the back. And so, I think having had that global perspective in your capacity in your functions, where are we in terms of getting to that sort of internationally recognized set of frameworks? How do we ensure that, players in different parts of the world, whether it be in China or India or, small startup in the Bay Area, actually follow these rules? And, now more than ever, we're seeing the consequential role that technology can play in elections or in spreading fake news. Facebook had the whole scandal with Cambridge Analytica on the US elections 4 years ago. And so how do you ensure that companies, regardless of how big they are or how much power they have or how small they are, really follow these rules and play by the same standards for the sake of protecting individuals?
That's a great question. In fact, as I mentioned, there's over 100 ethical frameworks, but there's some dominant ones. The IEEE, I with 3 E's, is actually the world's largest computing engineering organization. And they created a process model called PD7000 where you can operationalize all of those ethical sort of framework standards into something which is useful when you're creating code and so on, or managing an entire system. So if you go to these nonprofits like the IEEE, the ACM, which is the world, it's called the Association for Computing Machinery. It's the world's largest #1 computing science organization, and they've got a code of ethics and principles of accountability, responsibility, and transparency. So there's another model that can be followed. But they are working together. So this idea that governments are coming together with industry and academia, and that's already happening, from ethical frameworks to operationalization, so you can actually meaningfully use it. And the UN is involved. As I mentioned, there's this really famous conference called AI4Good, and they're operationalizing this aspect. Okay, how can we put some standards in place, but working with the IEEE, working with the ACM, working with 193 governments. So that's already happening right now. Unfortunately, you can't manage rogue entities. It's like biohacking and genetic editing. You can't manage some of these rogue entities out there. And hopefully, if we get enough critical mass of countries, industry, and academic organizations all coming together, then in some ways we can say this is meaningful. So there's a lot of noise out there, and that's why you have to go to trusted sources like UN agencies or Partnership on AI, which has all of these big Fortune companies behind it, or like I said, the ACM, IEEE. You can trust those entities and go to these trusted sources.
Excellent, excellent. So I think that's sort of a really great understanding of what the baseline of the work being done is, and you really mentioned, some of the leading players in this game, the international accreditation boards or the organizations of IEEE or ACM. And so, to those who are pursuing engineering or science degrees, it's very beneficial to look these up, learn more about them, what kind of research is being published under their arm, and what the big players in that field are. So now I want to sort of broaden the perspective and think a little in the long-term sort of phase. And I want to get the perspectives of Dr. Karimi and Saqib, one as an educator who's really thinking about how to equip the next sort of wave of students, but also Saqib as somebody who's working on the ground on these cutting edge technologies. Very simply said, where do you see AI going in the future? Good, bad, what sort of sectors do you see this technology really playing a big role, whether it be in healthcare, in education, so on and so forth? And specifically for this audience, how can companies, how can academic institutions or organizations provide opportunities for youth to get involved with these efforts? And Dr. Karimi, you can start off.
Okay, thank you. So where it is going, so there are usually approaches of thinking about this AI taking over, or like fear-based kind of seeing the future. I'm on the optimistic side, even though I care about the policies. I think we are going to see a lot of application of these algorithms in very small, specific, improve very small, specific problems for us, and the problems that are dependent on a large set of data. And how we can get our youth involved. So we are starting, one of the things that I'm seeing and I'm glad about, we are, with the wealth of information that we have in hand about the AI specifically, we are starting the education pretty early. So there are a lot of resources that there are out there for students who want to learn about AI. And if you want to use that breadth of information about AI to apply it to different kind of disciplines, there are many opportunities for students available to be involved, either in academia or in industry. So to start off, I would say, like, start with a program that gives you some sort of guideline towards what you like. And then when you find your path, there are many opportunities that could be given to you. For example, again, I would say CFAR, which is one of our sponsors for the Invent the Future program, they have pan-Canadian strategy for AI. Those kind of resources that give you some sort of path with different kind of resources that you can use to start off your way, that would be great to start. And even though, like, for people who do not have any exposure yet and want to start up right away after this call, I would say there are resources. Like, for example, one of the student panelists previously said that their exposure started with seeing some games in the AI that had their interest. So there are some of them online, like AI experiments in Google. It is in the AI experiments, the name is AI experiments with Google, and you can go there and there are many experiments done with Google with the codes that are openly available on GitHub for you to see. Go play, see how it feels for you, and if it's the right like direction for you, there are pointers that you can follow from there.
Excellent, and I hope you guys are taking notes. Those are some wonderful resources that you guys should all check out. And so Saqib, if you could also touch on that as somebody who's working on the ground, who's had experience in the VC arm in the Bay Area, where do you see AI going, and what are opportunities to get involved in this new wave?
Yeah, I think without touching on how the education system is, because it's been a while since I've been in school and I don't know what what's being taught nowadays or what the curriculum is, but I know that obviously every time that something needs to be new, it goes through, I'm pretty sure, like a lot of internal battles before it could be put on the curriculum. And I think that's why I'm going to touch base again on the free resources that are available that kids or students can take advantage of, because obviously if you're in school, you're like, oh man, I wish our school did this and that. It's like, man, just take a course online from MIT or Stanford. You'll be way ahead of anybody else in your class. Where it's going, that's a very loaded question, in a sense that I could sit here and talk about like a lot of possible ideas where I feel like AI is going to do a lot of good, right? Healthcare, for example, as you touched on, and there's been more than I think enough research or studies where like, oh yeah, AI does a better job than physicians and at picking out cancer or whatever it is, right, and stuff like that. And I think it was in one of the books by Malcolm Gladwell, and this is before AI even came out. It was just like looking at patterns, right? It was like, okay, you know what, a heart attack person would come in, sometimes it would take a while for the doctor to get to that person, but then, they just quote unquote trained, a system on some patterns, and it's like, okay, now it does a lot of better job. Okay, this person needs to be cared for because, he's had a heart attack because this is the symptoms that he's showing. So I think, healthcare is obviously a bigger one. Autonomous vehicles, that's obviously been the one of the I think one of the hottest ones for a while, and I don't know where how far level 5 is going to be, where like everything is just autonomous, you don't have to worry about anything. Tesla is, I think, I want to say what, level 2, level 3, whatever Elon Musk claims to be. So it's going to be a while we're there, but I think when that comes in handy, it's going to be a pretty game-changing thing that could happen, right? Because I think it was Google that did it with Waymo, where they made a video of a person who was blind and they couldn't drive, right? And they put them in like a driverless car, and the person is able to, get around by just telling which destination to go to, or whatever the case might be. So I think, obviously there's a lot of good from a fintech side. I think AI is still in the early stage because, like I said, I worked at hedge funds where people were still using, Bloomberg terminal system to look at tickers, figuring out, all these funny or interesting DCF models and all the analysis. But I feel like, there's going to be a time where some companies have started already doing, AI, quote unquote, robo advisors, I think that's what they're called. But it won't be long before, that becomes, I think, the norm from a fintech side as well. So there's definitely a lot of avenues. But, there are a lot of ideas as well where I'm like, why do you need AI? And there's no need for machine learning. But I think, in a broader spectrum, yeah, there's still a lot of, I think, exploration to do.
Definitely, and I think you touched on some really great points. And I think the one that sticks out for me is, or at least the general takeaway is that data is sort of the new gold. And a lot of these companies, whether it be in the fintech space, in the ed tech space, or healthcare, the performance of AI has been increasingly improving because of the access to data. And what you'll notice is that a lot of these machine learning models are public. But the one thing that isn't public that, companies like Google or Facebook are very protective about is the user data. And so there's certainly, very big interest in protecting user privacy and user data. But I, want to go back and, I'm sure everyone is dying to get your perspective as well, Stephen, as somebody who has such a broad and global sort of experience and exposure. We touched on it earlier about some of the promises and threats, but, generally, where do you see AI going? Where do you see the sectors where AI can be promising? How can it be used in emerging markets, for instance? And in what capacities can it be used to actually address very critical social problems?
It's a great question. Actually, in the last quarter of 2017, AI infiltrated or expanded to every major industry in the world. And the World Economic Forum in 2018 came with a future jobs report, which is really fascinating, where they surveyed 12 industries. And if you look at the adoption of AI, it's in the 70 to 80 percentile. And that's globally across these 12 major industries, and including in both developed and developing marketplaces. So what's happened is AI is being optimized and it's being sort of shrunk and increasing in efficiency. For example, using something called Darwin AI attention condensers is one example, where you can put it on the edge, put it on edge devices, the 40 billion Internet of Things, mobile devices. You don't even have to go to the cloud. It could be local. You also have new kinds of chips like photonic chips, which are coming out, which are optimized for AI, and you can get maybe 10 to 1,000 times performance increase. So really, the proliferation is already happening. It's built into every phone, it's in search, it's in your email, it's everywhere. And you're gonna get a broader adoption in business once businesses can find a useful place to put it or pilot it and then scale it within the organization. In fact, when I work with CEOs, they think that's probably the biggest issue right now. And that's where you can go to something like Microsoft AI Business School, responsible AI, because it gives you use cases to sort of practically take you into the application of it, from start to really implement it throughout the corporation itself. So, but really the dynamics is everywhere. Like I'm actually on the Innovation Council. It's a think tank of the World Food Program, which is the world's largest humanitarian program. In fact, they're the world's largest UN agency. And they have AI embedded into their food security startups. And this is, again, both developed and developing countries. So because it's an ability to give these kinds of results to help in decisions to optimize logistics that no other system can have. You also have telemedicine. And what the pandemic has done is accelerated what would normally happen in medicine in 10 years is now happening now. How? Through 5G, AI robotics and disinfectant robotics, AI and big data being used to manage the logistics of the different materials, vaccines, and so on. So really the proliferation is already there. It's everywhere, and it's going to continue to do so. And in fact, my prediction is it's going to even accelerate maybe by 20%, and even use of the robotics aspect will accelerate as well. So being in the 80 to 90 percentile globally, and even robotics being in the 50 percentile globally.
Excellent, excellent. And I actually want to follow up with, a somewhat slightly, unrelated question, but I think still drawing on your perspectives as somebody who's worked across, multiple CEO sort of communities and suites and so on and so forth. In a highly globalized world, we're seeing very diverse and oftentimes conflicting values and moral codes. And one of the questions that have been coming up is, surrounding ethics and human rights for robots and moral codes. And so, as we reach this point in time where we have, very differing and oftentimes contrasting and conflicting values, how should, should there be a moral code or an underlying understanding of how humans develop and treat AI? A very traditional example is the trolley car problem, where, you're driving down a path, you veer off and kill, a pet dog, or you go straight and you kill a human, And so there's sort of a common understanding that a human life should never be sacrificed. But now more than ever, especially with self-driving cars that, Sakib has mentioned, you get to a point where there's this very conflicting sort of scenario where it's hard to discern what the right decision is. And so at a point where globally there's becoming a very diverse moral code and ethics code, how do we approach the development and sort of the deployment of AI systems?
So, again, that's a very great question. In fact, the European Union actually addressed this in 2017. The European Parliament asked the European Commission to address this question. Should robots, autonomous robots, be legal entities? Like, do they own the IP they create? What are the liability issues? And they even came up with a draft or a resolution of civil law rules around robots. Though in 2018, there was an open letter from experts, and they say, are you crazy? You're talking about granting robots legal status? That's inappropriate. So there's a big debate out there in terms of these entities and what should we do about it. So it really is moving in that direction. Maybe there's got to be some kind of accountability associated with robots, and where is that going to go? And as they become more self-administrating, self-learning, what are the implications of that? So it's more than a debate now. As I mentioned, the European Union is even led. And you see some of this even baked into this sort of general data protection regulation that the European Union came out with, where now what about the human interaction? Well, you actually have the absolute right to contest something that's made by an automated system. You can ask for transparency and look at the underlying data, how it made its decision, and so on. So very active discussion, but ultimately, I don't think we can stop it. And it's going to be embedded in the regulation throughout the world, throughout governments, organizations, academia, and so on.
Yeah, definitely not an easy problem to think about or certainly solve. So before we wrap up, I just want to give the three panelists an opportunity to, one, sort of share in your respective sort of field what your future plans are as entrepreneurs, as academics, as researchers, as board members and investors. What are your future plans? How do you hope to continue your work and advocacy around ethics, privacy, and security? And what would be sort of a recommendation or piece of advice that you can provide these up and coming world leaders and contributors in AI and science? And Saqib, we can start off with you.
Yeah, sure. I think from to answer your first question, first part of that question, our plan is to just keep on focusing on coming up with the creative ways for synthetic speech, and different ways of creating that speech. So, for example, one of the things that we did right now, which is what we used for the YouTube video that we made for Linus, was when we created his voice. His team was like, okay, it sounds like him, but this is not the way he would say things, right? So we had his teammate record the script, and we applied his style to that voice to create like the actual experience that would sound like him. Next thing we're working on is foreign languages, dubbing, and all that fun stuff, and down the road maybe like songs, right? So we're still in the early stage of coming up with ideas on how we can become like a full spectrum audio company from that angle. And to your second point about what we're doing and how we're going to be working on from an ethical standpoint and making sure we're on top of that. I think it's still come back to my earlier point, which is us remaining as ethical and moral to our roots, and making sure the team understands it too. So when every time an employee joins in our handbook, it says that the data that's sent to us is the property of the the client, and you can't do anything with it and all that fun stuff. And then we have implemented other stricter ways. For example, we did open source Python. We open sourced Resemblizer, which is the idea which is an open source GitHub to detect fake speech, because we're like, okay, we made this tool. This is not our core business, but we'll open source it so people can actually utilize it. So we're working on different ways on I guess making sure that we're looking at it from a positive side too, and see what we can do to counter the malicious use that could happen. And I think anybody wanting to get involved, especially like most of the audience right now, that's, as you mentioned, is going to be starting school or looking at what they want to do, is just see what interests them and see how AI could be, if there's potential to leverage AI in that field, whether it's healthcare, fintech, or any other bazillion fields out there, right? And I think, like I mentioned, right now, there's more than enough resources for you to like figure out, okay, what I really want to do and learn and tackle that from that angle.
Definitely. And best of luck to you and the team in continuing, the amazing work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, sorry. One last thing, forgot to mention is, I just cold email people. I understand students are like, oh, I don't know if that person's gonna apply. To be honest, if the person doesn't apply, they don't apply, right? And somebody it will eventually end up replying to you. So, just reach out and, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm interested in this. And yeah, go from there. Just reach out to people that you look up to, people that have done stuff that you're like, okay, this is what I want to do, and just get their feedback. Simple as that.
Definitely. Great advice. Dr. Creamy, would you like to take an opportunity to speak?
Yes, I'm going to talk about my own personal plans. So on the research side, applying some of these on the learning on the edge is one of my personal interests. But aside from that, because I saw it in the chat box as well, one of the questions was about how it is going to change the nature, like how it is going to affect jobs and unemployment, AI. So this is one of my, because I'm interested in societal problems as well. One of the things that I got interested recently. So I see that AI going to change the nature of the jobs. I don't think it's necessarily going to cause unemployment, but it's going to change a lot of nature of a lot of jobs. For example, you have seen that people moving to the gig economy kind of jobs, and now some of the robots are taking over the jobs that have a specific non-skill dependent kind of jobs. I am very interested on finding solutions of finding the way of making the transition faster. And that's one of my personal concerns, like looking towards the future.
Excellent. That's wonderful. And Stephen?
That's because I do a lot. Well, I founded AI for Good, which has been adopted across 183 governments and something like 900 corporations and academic institutions like Mila out of Montreal, for example, has an AI for Good program. And that's a very famous research group. So I'm going to continue supporting AI for Good. And by the way, we have weekly webinars, and they're free, about AI, about all the big questions, how can we apply it, and so on. So I'm going to continue with that and all the other UN agencies I'm supporting. From an investor standpoint, I actually support even ones we don't invest in, those support companies that we think are really doing interesting work. There's one called Fake or Fact, and where they can tell you if something's real or not, and even tell you whether it's opinion or agenda driven. You should put it in your, it's free. Anybody can use it. There's another one called Event Registry. It's not free, but you can trial it, and it gives you all sorts of ability to analyze information. There's a company called Darwin AI, which was on that CB Insights 100 list. And they have something called generative synthesis, which allows you to have transparency with AI. So those are the kinds of things I find really interesting from an investment standpoint. And then, of course, I'm on the boards of things like the ACM or within the IEEE and so on. The ACM, this Association of Computing Machinery, we created a new tool called Selects on AI. It's just about to be launched, which is almost like a tutorial on using AI. Anybody can use it. We have regular webinars, free to attend, on the applications of AI. There's also Microsoft, and Brooke, you probably would want this mentioned, right? You have Microsoft AI, like Azure AI, AI Lab, AI Blog. There's Microsoft AI School. Great resources for students to get acclimatized into what AI is and how you can apply it. There's something called Live Steam from E2 Ventures. It's free. I recommend you have a look. And then it's been mentioned before, Coursera, edX, Udacity, Udemy, Pluralsight, and others. And, GitHub, Gaggle, or Kaggle, and OpenAI would be other areas. And then if you've got a sort of a business as a young person and you want to sort of business up, there's Microsoft AI Business School, which is some really interesting resources and case studies. So.
Excellent. I hope you guys are taking notes, because those are some very, great resources and opportunities. And Stephen, I'm sure if you could share the link to the webinar, a lot of folks on this call, myself included, would love to be a part and join and learn more about some of the work that's being done with AI for good. But yeah, with that, we definitely want to thank, all the wonderful panelists for their breadth of experiences and their contributions in this space and how they've been able to share a lot of, these insights to our audience members. I think for me, there's sort of 4 key takeaways. One is, be optimistic. And Dr. Creamy really talked about this. She has a very optimistic outlook. And I think in order to do good, we need to think good. And so definitely encourage all of you to be very optimistic about the potential of science and technology, and specifically AI. In the work that's being done, as Sakib has mentioned, always consider the ethics, the security, the privacy through your scientific and business contributions. And I think the third point would be, it's a very rapidly evolving field, and there's a lot of great resources online. Stephen's mentioned some, Dr. Creamy has mentioned research opportunities. Sakib has dropped a couple links. So stay educated, check those links out, stay informed, and network. Reach out to a lot of people, a lot of folks. We have awesome people on the panel today, and they've been willing to share their time. So be very proactive about reaching out to people. And I think the fourth and most important is don't drop out of school. So with that, we'll hand it back off to the organizers. But thank you so much all for a wonderful session, and we hope that you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much to our moderator, Brooke Kiffel, and our amazing panelists today, Stephen, Sakib, Dr. Karmi. Unfortunately, Jay's technical difficulties did get in the way and he was unable to join us. For our fellow students, stick around after a quick break. We'll be starting our next panel, which is finance, moderated by AI and data analyst specialist, Sarah Sun. And we'll be starting that at 5:05 p.m. MST.
Yeah, I would highly recommend you guys attend the finance one, especially if you're maybe interested in cryptocurrency, or if you want to get into I don't know, consulting or something. So please stick around, and we'll be back in 15 minutes.